he did nothing wrong, that there was a clause within a clause within a clause that cited that if there should be acute problems vis-a-vis the care of a young child because of coronavirus, it was permissible to do what they did, and therefore they don't think that anything they did was wrong. They don't think that if he'd been apprehended by a police officer, he'd have been fined or told to turn around and go home. They don't think that there's any role modelling that isn't impeccable and absolutely by the book in every way, and so therefore they would say, well, if everybody copied Dominic Cummings, which of course they won't and can't, but if they did, there'd be nothing wrong with it anyway because he was only doing the right thing.
Well, yes, I think that's certainly what we're hearing consistently. But I think if we were to sort of scrutinise it by the book, we'd not only find the number of inconsistencies that have proved a frustration for everyone who's studied this in detail and tried to kind of find workarounds to for all sorts of circumstances. The government advice in its detail wasn't necessarily consistent or particularly clear. It certainly couldn't deal with every set of circumstances. But also, he did acknowledge that in two instances he did go beyond what the government was asking of members of the public, which was his trip to the castle. And which, as you mentioned, to test his eyesight, which seems a little far-fetched, albeit clearly, sort of misjudged incidents. And the fact that after his wife had shown signs of being unwell, he then returned to work, which was a secondary instruction that we were given very clearly, is that if anyone in your household was unwell, you too were to isolate. The sort of ethics and the decision making around him as a father deciding what was best for his family is more complicated, and obviously the rule book, should we call it, doesn't go case by case, and so doesn't have a sort of decision making diagram through which you can kind of find very clear instruction from the government on it.
He talked a lot about the importance of his getting back to work urgently because of the very important decisions that he has to make, and therefore you might say he was saying, I'm very important, I'm extremely important, and therefore I must get back to work really, really urgently because I'm very important. Now you may say, well, he is, for goodness sake, he is very important. He is the special advisor to the Prime Minister. You don't get to be much more important than that. Then there was also the bit where he said, I didn't tell Boris, or I didn't ask him, I didn't tell him, because I'm the person that has to sift through matters and decide which of those I want to go to discuss with the Prime Minister, which I'm trying to protect the Prime Minister from or shield him to sort of carefully husband his time, etc. Which I think to some people sounded a bit like I'm the kingmaker, I'm more important than the Prime Minister because I get to decide what I will ask him about, and I get to make decisions that I don't even tell him about. So I don't know whether there was a feeling of some people felt there might be a narcissism at play here, which was, I am so important that it's only the little people who have to abide by the rules that I make, but I'm really too important, and I get special medical advice, and I get to do all sorts of autonomous things that other people don't get to do because I'm really important. Do you think that was one of the messages that people might have taken home from it?
I suspect that unfortunately may well have been certainly the way that he sort of conducted his response and responded to questions. That may well have been the impression that he gave. Whether he intended to do that, I don't know. I think one thing I'd say, Downing Street, there is a bubble mentality around working in Downing Street, and I think that intensifies in moments of crisis like this.
So when you were special advisor, Jonathan, to Theresa May, did you think, you must have felt, well, I'm very important, I'm incredibly important, I'm making really, really important decisions, some of which I consult the Prime Minister about, some of which I just take on my own because I'm really important, and therefore I have to do things like get to places really quickly with police outriders, making sure that I don't have to wait in traffic jams. I have to, I get to do stuff other people don't get to do because I'm very important. Did you feel that to some extent?
You understand the importance of the work that you do, I think, and you've got to be disciplined to realise that. To sort of uncouple that, I suppose, between the responsibility and the nature of your work and the sort of self-importance, I suppose, that has been interpreted from Dominic Cummings' actions throughout this time. I suppose that the two things that we ought to uncouple to sort of show some compassion to Dominic Cummings' circumstances is if we separate his decision-making as a father and making the best interests in terms of making sure his 4-year-old was well cared for and looked after in a moment of not only sort of personal crisis but professional crisis, in terms of he's obviously working and chewing over an intense workload, given the nature of what was going on, particularly much earlier in this, in the virus, as well as separating his sort of decision making as a public official. And the thing I thought of most quickly is that you do, as a senior official, have to hold yourself to a higher level to account. You've got to hold yourself and be prepared to stand up to a higher level of scrutiny because of the nature of your work and because of the example that you set. And yes, you know, from time to time, it's incredibly thrilling and incredibly honouring and incredibly hard work and incredibly focused. Your mind is sort of solely focused on the nature of what you do. But if you lose contact and lose sight of that sort of wider sense of your place within the public and the impact that your work has on your personal life, that's when you start to get into difficulty and when people make poor decisions. And that's the same in politics, that's the same among senior business leaders. All of those decisions can undermine your authority within a minute if they're made out of poor circumstance or out of in that instance.
All right.
And so you've got to be so
question,
careful.
Jonathan. Will he stay?
Yeah, I knew you'd ask. I think you know that if there's another 24 or 48 hours or 36 hours in this story, and we're still talking about it as we discussed earlier when we spoke, there's you know, the pressure will only intensify. I think there's something to be said about that in normal times. You know, this is a real sort of classic political crisis, and he might well have gone much sooner. But it's clear that the Prime Minister values his input and his advice, and which is why he's gone to such lengths to defend him. So certainly we're not going to see him sort of being dismissed or that resignation being coordinated, shall we say. But I think there may come a point later in the week, if we're still talking about this, that the pressure grows to the extent where actually it becomes easier for him to leave his roles. But it's difficult to tell at the moment whether that's going to be the case. I'm inclined to say with you, Vanessa, I think we might all tire of this and may well move on. And that's also in part because of the nature of this crisis. You know, there's still people dying.
Exactly.
There's still critical
there are a lot of other
decisions the
things to
government
talk
are
about.
making.
It's not as if it's the only story, is it? That's the
Exactly,
thing.
yeah.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Good to talk to you. Jonathan Stock, former special advisor to Theresa May, so he really has stepped in Dominic Cummings' shoes. Now it is time for Greg Mackenzie and Make a Difference.
BBC Radio London.
Make a difference.
Big shout out to the young players at Hammersmith and Fulham Rugby Football Club who have raised more than £50,000 for Charing Cross Hospital by passing a rugby ball in their back gardens.
She's going to interview someone now, and she's going to try and trip him up every step of the way.
Wait, are you recording?
Required a total of 110,000 passes.
That's all right, we can talk for a moment, but listen. Alright? Smile when you feel like it, but don't say out.
Initial target was a modest £10,000 to raise for the hospital at Palace Road, but generous donations have seen that soar to well over £51,000. So big well done to everyone involved in that. Now for King Dog Lovers at the International Animal Welfare Trust, they have a dog named Daisy. She's 12 years old. Sadly, her owner was taken ill last month and can no longer look after her. They're looking for a new home for Daisy. We're told that she is an uncomplicated Jack Russell Terrier who likes going on walks and eating tasty treats. She's been medically checked by a vet, vaccinated and microchipped, even given an individual training plan and 4 weeks free pet plan insurance. Now, if you're interested in giving Daisy a home, get in touch with the National Animal Welfare Trust. Their email is reception@nawt.org.uk, or you can give them a call. Their number is 0208 950 0177. Finally, the Old Vic has launched a new digital project to offer audiences content online whilst it's locked down. Venue ambassadors Claire Foy and Matt Smith will lead a new online Old Vic educational hub with resources, how-to guides and interviews to inspire teachers, students and parents, whilst an intergenerational scheme will connect the over 60s with primary school children through letters, emails and phone calls. Several of the Old Vic's archive recordings will be released for free on YouTube, starting with the award-winning production of Patrick Netta Monster Calls, which is directed by Sally Cookson. Production featuring the original cast will go live at 7 p.m. next Friday, that's the 5th of June, and will be available to watch until the following Thursday. If you want to get in touch with us and tell us about something that's going on in your area, then our email address is makeadifference.london@bbc.co.uk. Our phone number here is 0800 731 2000.
BBC Radio London.
Make a difference. Thanks to Greg for Make a Difference. Mike's on the line in Raynham. Hello, Mike. Good morning to you.
Good morning, how are you?
I hope okay, and I hope you are as well. Dominic Cummings, what do you think?
I'll be honest, I really don't care.
Okay.
I mean, if anything, he's actually done us a favour.
In what
because
way?
It shows how ridiculous our overreaction to this issue is.
In what way?
Right.
What do you mean?
Well, okay, so 0.006% of the world population have died from this. That's under 500,000, comfortably under 400,000, in fact. More than 500,000 die on Europe's roads each year, and no one says we have to stop getting in cars. We're bringing our country to a grinding halt, giving our children debts they're going to have to pay for the rest of their lives. No one's telling us how we're going to pay for the NHS or the welfare state in the future, because that's going to be at risk, right? And for what? So we save maybe 100,000 people from dying? You know, I'm sorry, the sums don't add up, right? We're going to pay so heavy for this in the future. It is ridiculous what we have done.
But have you not
the economy tomorrow?
But have you not heard the experts on my show say only 10% of us are infected so far or have been exposed, and therefore we've had 37,000 deaths approximately. When we all are exposed to the infection, that means we could have just under something like 400,000 deaths. I mean, that's an awful lot of tragedy and loss. Well, it's not. It's nothing unless it's you or your family or your child. Then, God forbid, it's the worst possible human tragedy.
Let me come back on that, right?
Yes.
There's human tragedy for somebody somewhere on the planet every day. Okay? So when we celebrate, what about your family? You know, what about your relative? What about your friend? What about you? I'm sorry, that one does not wash at all. Because, what about little Tilly in Africa who's starving to death because we can't be bothered to donate enough money to send him food or supply him with sufficient water? You know, it's hypocrisy. It's one more for, Lord's death. Whoever's playing in Malaysia or wherever, that's another whole completely.
And the idea, well, it does add, I mean, you can do the adding up because we've got lots of figures, haven't we? This is one of the few things you can add up. What about the idea that if we hadn't had lockdown, what would have happened would have been that the infection rate would have spiraled to the most prodigious extent. Of course, lots of people would have lost their lives, but even more, the NHS would have been completely overwhelmed. We would have had a situation where we had, for example, I don't know, bodies piling up in the streets, not enough ventilators, people, ambulances were already in holding bays waiting and queuing to get in. Already people were struggling to breathe. They felt as if a car was parked on their chest, they've told me on this show, and yet some people had hours and hours of delay until an ambulance could get to them. I mean, if we hadn't had lockdown and if the cases had spiraled and if the NHS had been utterly overwhelmed, what kind of a city in London would we have been living in? And just think of the level of tragedy and just think of the level of bereavement.
Let me come back to you with that.
Please do.
Right?
Yes.
I'm saying lift the lockdown now. I didn't say don't start some sort of control in the first place. We should have shut our borders at Christmas when we saw the Chinese running around like blue-ass flies.
All right, we don't say that on the radio in case anyone's
but
offended.
you know what I mean.
I know what you mean, but don't use the words because people don't like it.
I'm sorry I picked one of the three words was incorrect, all right?
Okay.
But they were running around like headless chickens. Is that acceptable?
That will do.
Okay, right. It was obvious they had no control over what was going on whatsoever. If we had closed our borders to the outside world, right, everyone would still be going to work. All the pubs and the clubs and the rest of it would be open. But no, we didn't do that because big business wanted to function because they didn't see what was coming. Now, we put people in positions of power who are supposed to be intelligent enough to see what's going on. And they didn't see this coming. I'm sorry. And then the WHO lied to us. Oh, it's not transmittable from human to human. When they knew damn well it was, it's pathetic. You know, our generation have got so much to apologise for to our children, right? And when we look for talking about people who are most at risk, it's our generation, the 50-somethings, the 60-somethings, people my age. Right? What have we done to our children?
But is it? Are you not being very, very strong on this when you say people lied? Was it not that it was a new virus that they hadn't seen before, that they didn't know what the ramifications were or who was going to be most susceptible? They weren't lying. They were feeling their way and they were trying to work it out. They didn't yet know.
I'm sorry, but if you look down a city of 11 million, you know there's a problem. You know there's a problem.
All right.
Right.
Yes, I can.
Right.
I can. Yeah, and certainly
Okay,
you sound absolutely furious in every particular. And I bet there'd be loads of people listening who feel exactly the same. So, Mike, thanks very much indeed. Good to hear from you. Thanks for ringing this morning. Let us go straight to the news headlines.